Hey, Mark, it's Michelle. Can I ask you a procedural question before we start? Uh, yeah, I see. Hold on. Taking care of it right now. And where's Mark?
Wait,
Hey, um, I realized I erred in posting the dates of the meeting minutes we're supposed to approve. So can we just table it and we'll do it the next meeting?
sure. Yeah, no
Okay.
problem.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
And where's Patty? Okay. I think everybody for the committee should be able to unmute. So good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Capano. I'm chair of the Housing Production Plan Committee. It is 7:01. So I'm going to call the meeting to order. Mike, I'm trying to unmute you. Do you see it? Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Attending in the meeting tonight from the committee is Michelle Capano, Mark Cullinan, Michael Raworth, Josie Reese, Patty Karras, and is there anybody else? I do not think so. Okay, great. So we'll get started. The first item was to approve the meeting minutes. However, we're going to table them because I posted the incorrect dates on the agenda. So I want to make sure that's correct. So we'll do them at the next meeting. The next was just a housing committee update. So I wanted to make sure for those that had not attended the last meeting, just to bring folks up to speed of where we are. So on October 24th, we published and submitted to the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board a draft agenda, excuse me, a draft of the housing production plan. And in there is a lot of information and content starting from when we did a housing needs assessment to the two community engagements that we held, the online survey, our evaluation of opportunity sites, our goals, and our strategies. And then we ended the deliverable with just a high level chart in terms of how we would execute. Since then, I've heard from members of the public, which has been great. We put together an FAQ. We just published that yesterday that addresses additional questions that people have been asking about affordable housing. And hopefully it will increase people's knowledge about this topic, about the housing crisis that's going on in Massachusetts, and hopefully, bring full circle, what we're trying to accomplish. As we have stated in earlier meetings, we've had many discussions about the opportunity sites. We've heard from members of the public. We presented these opportunity sites in the forum and through the survey. But these are just a proposal. And so it's important for our residents to understand that whatever ultimately gets decided is through the Board of Selectmen and may require a vote of town meeting. So these aren't guaranteed that we will build here or build there or develop in this location. What it does is communicate to the state. We have an ability to increase affordable housing in our community. We want to be good stewards to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We want to contribute to others in our community or outside of our community who want to live in Nahant or have an opportunity to stay in Nahant. And so these housing plan is that first step. It's the first time the town has actually done a project or a deliverable like this. And one of the things that's really important to also understand is this is just a 5-year plan. So anytime during the first 5 years, we as a community and as a town can make updates. So if we find something new that we see in our community as more advantageous, and the Board of Selectmen decide that they want to move forward with that could be considered and amended in the plan. We know just in Massachusetts, but also, in the US, things happen economically as well. And so, if something happens that we need to make a change to the plan because of economics in our community, that would be another example to move back to the plan and say, you know what, we're going to make these changes and communicate them to the state.
Let me
So
add something to clarify, if I may. Even though the action on what we've got here lies in the hands of others, principally the Board of Selectmen or maybe the Planning Board, by getting this plan in place and through a couple of stages of approval, the town may buy time before that protects it from the risk of a hostile 40B. And there will be things that the town will have to do in order to continue to enjoy that protection. But the approval through several downstream steps of this plan can buy the town protection for a measured amount of time.
Correct.
Going forward.
So I was going to move into that. So thanks, Michael.
Sorry.
So one of the things about this plan and whatever activities that we as a community and a town move forward with is also to achieve safe harbor. And there's several mechanisms in the plan that allows us to do that. Whether we build a subsidized housing project, where we do a combination, or we do subsidized housing and affordable housing vis-a-vis 55 plus community, veterans housing, different combinations along with looking at the gross area of the town will allow us to use that as mechanisms to achieve safe harbor. As long as we demonstrate over the next 5 years how we're doing that, that will ultimately help in terms of alleviating residents' concerns about an unfriendly 40B development should something like that ever happen. So I wanted to spend some time in a few minutes of this meeting today to kind of just communicate some of these updates to the public. Afterwards, I'm going to open it up to any other further questions or comments from the committee, and then we'll move into public comments. So for members of the committee, I don't know if anybody has any further comments, but if you want to raise your hand and let me know, and I'll make sure that you're unmuted, then we can certainly have your opportunity to speak.
I would just add to what you said, Michelle, and what Mike said. Not only does the submission of this plan with the approval of the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board to the state grant us a safe harbor from an unfriendly 40B, it also begins to address our requirements under the new MBTA. Was it 3A? 3A law, because this helps us come in compliance with that. If we're not in compliance with that, I'm sure everybody's been following the news in the Boston Globe and on television. The Attorney General is really going after communities that are thumbing their nose at these types of things, and they're not going to put up with it any longer. And I frankly don't blame them. So I think it provides a lot of the requirements that the state is looking for in terms of coming into compliance. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Is there anybody else from the committee that had comments?
Hi, this is Josie Reese.
Thank you, Josie.
I think that the plan has to happen, and I've been very happy to participate as part of the subcommittee. The two things that I've heard the most concern over was, number one, 40B is subsidized housing. And subsidized housing, along with the GLAM, along with an unfriendly 40B, could mean zoning changes and a lot of other things. So the one thing that we have to understand is that all the sites are being identified to try to find the right combination of locations. It does not mean that there's going to be one large high-rise project at one particular location. So the more sites that we identified, the opportunities are there to be able to, maybe, not saying it's going to happen, but to divide up the units so that there will not be one large 84-unit rental subsidized housing in one location, unless that makes sense. But that seems to be a concern that I've heard quite a bit. And I just want the public to know that, yes, it is a risk. Yes. However, the subcommittee has talked about it a lot. The selectmen have talked about it a lot. We've reached out to Tony to say what guarantees or what things are in place to help us avoid that situation. So when you're asking your questions today, there are risks involved, indeed. But if we manage this properly, if we all go in it with our eyes open, then we might have better options instead of being told what to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. Yes, Michael.
I just want to clarify based on what Josie said so that people do not confuse the two things that we're operating under. The 84 units has to do with the MBTA zoning requirement. And it may be that even though we comply with the zoning requirement, that no one ever builds pursuant to the zoning permission that we're required to grant. Yes, it does require us to grant zoning that would permit 84 units, but that does not mean that that will ever take place. By contrast, under 40B, we do have to make sure that additional units happen, but we need to not confuse those two. Our obligation to do things to gain the safe harbor under 40B is completely independent of our obligation to provide for the zoning permission under 3A, just so that those don't get confused.
Thank you, Mark. And how many units was it for the subsidized housing that need to be built?
My calculation is it's 113.
So 113. And again, another question that I've heard, but I haven't answered, but so today we have the opportunity to answer is, does that mean that it's in addition to what we currently have, or what we have can be counted towards that?
No,
And
what we
addition-
have can be counted towards that. We have to achieve 10% of the total units in Nahant.
Yeah, but the 10% is 161, and 113 is derived from 161 minus 48, which
Yes.
is what we currently have.
That's
So
right.
the delta, the new construction is 113, and actually, technically, if we were to do that tomorrow, that would increase the total housing stock in town by from about 1,600 to about 1,700. So it would increase the number that we totally would have to have by a few, but not in a significant amount.
Correct.
Josie, I just want to clarify, thank you for bringing that up. There is a difference between subsidized housing and affordable housing. What we're trying to address here primarily is affordable housing. And one final thing, Michelle, before we move on,
Mhm.
I want the public to understand that this is just a plan. Any action on implementing this plan, regardless of the site or location, is going to require a town meeting vote. So, so this is not the be all and end all. It's simply a plan. Any action on this plan will require a town meeting vote. It's not a decision made by the Board of Selectmen.
Thank you, Mark. Dana, I see your hand is up, so you can go right ahead.
Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate that. This is Dana Sheehan, Housing Authority, also on the committee. Just full disclosure, I did vote, although I want to emphasize I support the affordable housing initiatives that the goals have been set for. But I did oppose this plan. I felt like it needs some changes, and it goes counter to past votes by the town meeting. But having said that, my comment now is that this plan doesn't really sufficiently address 3A. And that to me is low hanging fruit. So if we could get the sections of this plan built up to address 3A, which sound like zoning changes, then the plan would be more robust. And
So Dana, let me correct you for a moment. This plan is
Sure.
a housing production plan. We have a separate project to focus on 3A, which is going to come later. And that project will focus on the zoning changes. There is no distinction, no requirement by the state that we need to include 3A in the housing production plan. And so we would like to keep them separate.
okay, that's a decision that was made. But to make the plan, more set for the state, and 3A seems like it's work that could be done relatively quickly with the consultants. That's what I'm getting at here. Is if this plan, instead of waiting to do it later, we do the 3A now and then complete the plan. And that's the point.
Okay. Is there anybody else from the committee that wanted to make any comments or ask any questions? Okay, all right. For members of the public, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. I ask that you raise your hand first to be acknowledged by the chair. Please state your name and your address. I'm first going to start out with a question that's in the chat from Suzanne Macrelli. Nahant is closer to meeting the GLAM threshold of 1.5% with developing only 3.5 acres. Why do we always only mention the 10% of housing units, which is much more difficult threshold to reach? So right now, based on the GLAM analysis, our threshold is around 2.5 acres to meet in order that safe harbor requirement. But that's, again, safe harbor, which is only one of the mechanisms to achieve. Why do we always mention the 10% of housing units? Because we're under 40B, we need to allocate 10% of housing units towards affordable housing. So hopefully, Suzanne, that answered your question. Feel free to type more in the chat if you have follow-ups.
Michelle, can I add on to that for a minute?
Sure.
I think Suzanne is correct. Our focus primarily in terms of meeting safe harbor in terms of 40B will primarily be the GLAM analysis. It is unlikely, in my opinion, that we'll ever meet safe harbor in terms of the additional units themselves. So I think if we're going to meet that, it's probably going to be under GLAM.
Let me comment on that. I think that the GLAM analysis is very much needs to have our eyes kept on it, and it seems to be attractive, but I want to make sure there's no misunderstanding. I had earlier misunderstood that it was sufficient to satisfy the 40B safe harbor threshold to set aside the required square footage of land to achieve the 1.5%. But I've since been corrected to learn that it requires actual construction. So I'm not sure how that works in terms of the increments that we have to achieve to maintain safe harbor. But I also want to point out that I saw some stuff in researching this on the internet that suggested that no community had yet been successful in achieving safe harbor using the 1.5% criterion. So we need to be very careful about that.
great. Jeff Lewis, you can go ahead. Thank you. And
I'm not sure what buttons I'm pushing. Can you hear me?
yes, thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Um, Michelle, I read over the plan and it's wonderful.
And Jeff, before you start, just your address, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff Lewis, 6 Ellsworth Road, Nahant,
Thank
Mass.
you.
Um, the plan is very comprehensive. There's a lot of stuff in there. Some of it's way over my head. There's 2 areas that might get complicated, but they're in the, I'll ask him in the form of a question or an observation, and then should I do them both at one time or
Yes, please.
one at a time?
Go ahead.
Okay, the first one is the trust. I saw it in the best practices. My concern has to do with, we already have a Nahant Housing Authority. And the recommendation is to put in a housing trust for this aspect of housing in the town. And from my time on the Finance Committee, short albeit, the Housing Authority was sort of blind to the Finance Committee. We didn't have any insight into what was going on in their financial statements. I guess the question is, how will this thing function with 2 housing authorities? How do we keep control with the hands of the town fathers? And how do we get exposure to the Finance Committee? Because now we're gonna have 2 housing authorities with 2 budgets and they
Yes.
may in fact be
So
competing.
let me jump in here. So first of all, the Affordable Housing Trust is not a housing authority. The housing authority is responsible for maintaining and managing subsidized housing in the town of Nahant. What the Affordable Housing Trust will do is provide a financial vehicle and mechanism for receiving funds and the distribution of funds should we set up some type of development project. Therefore, there needs to be some dedicated oversight. The Affordable Housing Trust can also be a means to help support the execution of the housing production plan. So let's not confuse it that we're setting up a separate housing authority, because that's not what we're doing here at all. The Nahant Housing Authority, again, is focused on managing and maintaining the subsidized housing units, the 48 units that are currently in their charge. What we also have is CPC, and we have a housing component within CPC where a percentage of CPC funds goes towards housing and grants can be identified to fund out of that. We've done that already to help support the Nahant Housing Authority with some of their projects. It'll be an opportunity as the town wishes to either increase that percentage of housing out of the CPC funds that are generated to also fund the Affordable Housing Trust. We know affordable housing trusts are being actively used in other communities right now. Beverly is one of them, Swampscott's another. And they're using, again, as a mechanism to bring in capital so they can kick off their development efforts. Jeff, I know you had a second question.
And am I still on?
Yes.
The second question has to do with financial plan. I don't see a component in this for the financial alternatives. And I'm not sure how, it's probably just ignorance on my part, but I was looking at the Coast Guard housing, and I had a financial plan in the back of my mind that I was working under in my head. And I had seen that part of the recommendation was to take some of the lots and instead of selling them, they were going to be diverted to a different use. However, when I ran my own financial plan, it made sense after I ran the plan, because one alternative is to sell all 12 units The other plan was to sell 6 units at a higher unit cost and direct the others. And the net financial change on the 3 financial components came out the same. So I said, oh, okay, so that doesn't concern me because I know that we're not costing the town money, we're not leaving money on the table. But there may be some other people that aren't going to sit down and break out their Excel spreadsheet and do a comparison. And when the town fathers are going to make their decision, they're going to say, well, if I take choice 1, what's that going to cost us versus we do choice 2? What's that going to cost us? And I'll back out. That's my second question.
Okay.
And regarding the CPC, that's transparent to the finance committee. That goes through an entire meeting of, well, what are we spending on this, that, and the other thing. The housing authority, I didn't even know it existed until after the first finance committee. It wasn't even on the budget. So I never got a chance to look at what it's doing yet. It does consume a great many town services.
Okay.
So anyway,
Thank you.
those are my
So
questions.
in terms of the financial piece, I mean, there can't be a financial piece in this plan until a development site is actually identified, agreed to, and there's a developer agreement. So again, as we've stated, whatever is decided will ultimately go to town meeting and at town meeting, our hope is that, we put together what those plans might look like so the town can look at it and decide, is this what we want to move forward? Certainly, we don't want to present a tax burden to the taxpayer. We're hoping that, we can partner with a developer that can actually do this project for us. I'm going to just look at the chat for a moment. George Morhoven of Nahant asked, what does allowing single-family homes to build to a 2-family home or 3-family home by right mean, and how is that going to help the town? George, I think what your comment is on MBTA 3A communities, where
No,
a zoning bylaw.
Michelle, I
Yes.
think he's talking about ADUs.
Oh, ADUs. Oh.
Which is really sort of beyond our scope at this point, really.
Yeah, that is beyond our scope right now. So I think there's 2 pieces here: to build a 2-family home or a 3-family home, and ADUs by right mean. So we do have a recommendation here to allow a zoning bylaw change to allow ADUs. We also are going to be working on 3A, which will allow multifamily housing by right as well. So ADUs do not count towards affordable housing, but the multifamily may, depending on whether the owner does subsidize housing or not, or if it's a deed restricted, type of conversion of a single family home to a multifamily home. And then Dana Sheenan just provided a comment for the public. The housing authority runs under a state budget, and Nahant's budget is separate. All right.
So that explains why it would not have come to his attention on the FinCom, because it does not draw taxpayer funds from the budget of the town.
But it does consume town services.
Well, fair enough. That may or may not have a budgetary impact, but in any event, it's a budget independent of the town's fisc.
Okay. All right. Is there anyone from the public that had a question for the committee? You can certainly raise your hand and unmute to state your name and address for us. Okay, I see a comment in the chat from Josh Antrim on Nahant Road. Regarding the GLAM safe harbor, I did not fully understand the previous response. Can 40B compliance be achieved by meeting GLAM requirement, yes or no? 40B compliance cannot be achieved by meeting the GLAM, however, safe harbor can. So if we make incremental additions in units, we can achieve safe harbor for a period of time. But we would eventually need to meet the 40B requirement at some point. It will just give us a longer runway to do it.
Let me add to that. I think what he's asking is if we met the GLAM, the area requirement under 40B, would we be in compliance? And as Mike Walworth had stated, we would be, but that doesn't, the GLAM doesn't happen until after the development has occurred. So if we had one or two of the sites that we said, okay, let's develop this site or that site or a combination of sites, and we got developers and we built affordable housing on those sites, and that brought us over the area limit, then we would be in compliance with 40B. Is that correct, Mike?
That's the way I understand it. And
Must be
I don't know how that works with the incremental steps that are contemplated under the safe harbor, you know, if you will, the rolling safe harbor, the year by year safe harbor. Perhaps our consultant can tell us that, but I think we ought to understand that, because that's going to be our near-term challenge, to make percentage progress year by year until we finally achieve the total 40B safe harbor, either through the 1.5% of land area by GLAM or with the 161 units.
This is Josh. I can't figure out how to raise my hand in the box, but so from earlier conversations, I guess the statement about you're not compliant until you build the units is true for both GLAM and building the units, right? And from what I understand, asking Tony about this, is that there's no density requirement on that GLAM. In other words, in theory, I'm not proposing this as a solution, but in theory, you could have one rental unit on a 5-acre lot and meet the GLAM requirement. So
my understanding is that what you're suggesting as a, if you will, a shortcut is prohibited by some provision. I just don't know what it is. And the consultant's going to have to guide us on that, because if that were the case, everybody would run through that loophole and dodge the bullet, right? So I don't exactly know what it is, but there is some requirement that prevents somebody from doing something that that simple and evasive.
Yeah, so I guess I would ask the committee to know that answer before anyone has to vote on this, obviously. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. Let me just take a look at the chat to see if there's anything new. George Merhoven from Nahant asks, how does this affect the infrastructure of the town, police, fire, and DPW? Obviously, any development, when we increase number of units, number of households, more people, there will be an effect on infrastructure at some point. What that incremental is, we haven't done that analysis. Was not in scope for the plan. However, it would be something that we would consider, you know, and support and help the town guide them on understanding what those impacts would be.
But it's worth pointing out, that even in the study that we're reviewing, it's noted that we lost 12% of population in the last 30 years. And our school is at about 150 student population. When I was on the school committee, it was 200. And so we need to be thoughtful of making sure there's enough student population in the school to make sure that we can continue to have a school in Nahant. Because if we're obliged to shut down the school and send all the kids to Swampscott, that is not going to be good for anybody's property values. So while there may be an effect on public services from having our population grow a bit back toward the 12% that we lost, I think it's a big deal to make sure that we have enough population to keep a minimal population in the school to make it still viable and still a resource that would attract buyers to the town.
Just to add on to that, Michael, we know there's capacity at the Johnson schools. So if there was a development, you know, that took in new young families with children, we'd definitely be able to accommodate them.
Correct.
And I would add to that, Michelle, that you know, ironically, in terms of the people who are taking care of our infrastructure in this town in terms of streets, water, sewer, public safety and the such. I mean, affordable housing is directed at those types of employees. You know, it's the police, the fire, our teachers, and our DPW workers who are being forced out of this town and can't afford to live here anymore. Those are the same people who are caring for our infrastructure. Hopefully, in an indirect way, it will address that.
Thanks, Mark. Another question in the chat from George Mahovan, Little Nahant. How much will this plan cost the town? The plan effectively has, the only cost to the town right now was actually zero, as I understand. The part of this project is being paid for from a grant through CPC. The other part of the cost for this project was paid through a grant through the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. The execution of the plan, the execution of the goals and strategies, I think that's a great question. That would be another step that either this committee takes on, or how the Board of Selectmen decide with the town administrator through the goals and strategies to figure out what the costs are going to be for implementing some of those. All right, it's still available for any one of the members of the public to raise your hand and ask a question of the committee. All right, I'm going to go back to the chat from Cora Long on Nahant Road. If the many illegal apartments in town were allowed to comply to be legal two-family, how much closer would that make us to compliance for 40B?
Where is it?
Interesting question. So our compliance is around 113 units. So, and it also depends whether those properties would be either deed restricted or subsidized housing. So it's really up to the property owner to make a determination if they want to, you know, bring their property up to a level to, you know, be a two-family. If they're renting, you know, they want to put that deed restriction on their property, they can. And if they're, you know, renting to someone that's on subsidized housing, we'd like to know about it because that can help the town as well meet its 40B requirement.
Let me just add, Michelle, two components to that. You could have a tenant who qualifies as affordable housing, but in order to comply with the state, that has to be deed restricted, as you said. So you can't just have someone living in a house and say, well, they qualify for affordable housing. That's great, and I encourage that, but unless the unit is deed restricted, it doesn't qualify under the state.
So that's a good point that I want to bring up because I've heard quite a bit of confusion over that.
Yeah, what is deed restricted?
Deed restricted. So there are folks, you know, many folks out there who are very low income. And, you know, you may be familiar with this term or not, but they might get subsidized housing from Section 8. They might get it from the state. They might get it federal. The question that I came to the committee with, and I'm still not 100% clear on, and I've heard other people ask me the same question. If you have a tenant that lives in your home that gets the state funding to pay for their apartment, but you do not have a deed restriction on your property, but you allow them to live there and you rent to them, will that count towards the, you know, capital A affordable subsidized housing requirement in Nahant? Now, I think many people call that vouching system. It should be included in the plan. Does that require deed restriction? I think we need more research on that as well. That's something I wanted to see more clear in the plan, but that is something that I encourage the selectmen and the committee and the consultant to research a little bit more, because we shouldn't be forced to build all of these units if there are folks who are living here right now, or folks who want to expand their homes and would like to rent to someone who's in need and is eligible for that funding.
Thanks, Josie. I think our consultant did answer that question. several meetings ago, and I believe it does require deed restriction. I don't know the other members who might have been at that meeting, but I believe that's what our consultant told
I
us.
understood that the property needed to be deed restricted in order
I
to count
understand
towards
that, too.
affordable housing.
That's my understanding too, and if the voucher, if use of vouchers was an avenue that could help us get to 40B safe harbor, the consultants would have put it in writing in the report, and they did not. So I'm pretty sure while it is a valuable and useful social program, it just doesn't comply with what the state requires for what we need to do here. So it's a good idea, but unfortunately, it doesn't help us.
Okay. Is there anybody from the public that has a question that they would like to ask? Just raise your hand and make sure state your name and your address. Okay, I'm gonna jump to the chat, take a look at some questions here.
Yeah, sorry, Michelle, it's Josh Antrim,
Go ahead, Josh.
267 again. Regarding Cora's question earlier, and I think an earlier comment by the committee, is there a reason that the accessory dwelling units were not considered as part of this plan? I do understand, as Josie just pointed out, that it would require deed restriction, but it seems like a viable way of meeting the goal, the 10% requirement, without increasing population density, or at least without additional development.
Yeah,
So
Josh, I believe,
So
I believe,
ADUs by state statute are not applicable towards 40B.
but
Well,
I do believe that the plan does recommend that the town accept ADUs.
Right, and Josh, you need to understand that the ADUs are provided for by state statute, but it's done on a local option basis. And so there's a bunch of communities that have adopted ADU bylaws, but Nahant has not. So until we do, which obviously would require action by the planning board and a town meeting to adopt an ADU bylaw, I don't know that it's even lawful to build an ADU in town. And even if you were able to, there's a separate question of whether you can achieve the deed restriction on an ADU, which is built on the if you will, the surrounding
Yeah, so-
property of an existing home,
So a couple things,
without
Mike.
dividing the property.
So a couple of things. First of all, you can't build an ADU in town. We know those are prohibited. The second thing
Now.
is ADUs cannot be deed restricted, nor can they apply towards the 40B statute. ADUs, as part of the recommendation in the plan, are included because we are looking to increase housing inventory for everyone. So it's not just subsidized housing, it's people that are our essential workforce that are looking to live in our community. So if you recall the housing needs assessment, where there was some important data in there around the cost of living in Nahant, having an ADU on your property allows to help support that. So that's why the recommendation is in the plan.
That's good clarification, Michelle. Let me just add on to this that I am a big proponent of ADUs, and I hope that the town at some point can develop some rules and regulations around them. I had met last week with Senator Crichton, who is the sponsor of the new ADU bill, which would actually make it a matter of right, rather than going through special permits and other zoning loopholes. And he's quite confident that that's going to pass in this session of the legislature. So I think the whole question about ADUs will be settled at the state level, which I'm happy about. The town will still have the ability to set some reasonable rules and regulations around those ADUs, but I'm encouraged by Senator Crichton's bill to pass in this session of the legislature.
So Mark, can
Thanks,
you
Mark.
clarify one thing that you learned from Senator Crichton? Does his bill basically override the local option of towns to adopt or not adopt an ADU bylaw, or simply say that if a town does adopt an ADU bylaw, it must include X, Y, and Z?
No, it makes it a matter of right. So no variances, no special permit. They have to comply with the town's rules and regulations regarding ADUs, but it's a matter of right.
So
So
in
it'll be
other words,
similar
no,
to 3A with multifamily.
Right, exactly.
no
Okay.
town would have the ability to opt out of having ADUs. Is that right?
That's my understanding. Lynn, I see Lynn's here. She's muted, but you may know better than I, but that's my understanding of the proposed legislation.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just gonna pop into the chat, see if there's any new questions. George Mahoban, Little Nahant, is there a penalty for not meeting the 40B rule? The governor has not communicated whether there will be any penalties to communities not meeting 40B. We know that they've already communicated about 3A. So I think that's to be determined. Could you describe what?
Michelle, there is a penalty by not complying to 40B. And the penalty is that a developer could come in to the town, buy a piece of property, ignore the town's zoning bylaws, and build essentially whatever they want to build, as long as it met the affordability guidelines. So, for example, a developer could come in, buy the tides and the surf shop and the bank, for example, and put what you see in Revere Beach up, as long as it's affordable. So there is a penalty. It's
Right.
quite a steep one.
Yeah,
As-
so
as
I
long
look
as
at
it-
the question, let me just finish, Michael. I looked at this
Sorry.
question as, what is the penalty to the community, like in terms of lost funding opportunities? But you're right, in terms of a developer overstepping our zoning bylaws, absolutely.
And by the way, the development that Mark suggests would not have to be all affordable. It simply has to have a certain quantum of affordability built into it, which means they could have super luxury apartments on the top floor of anything that they built, as long as they had a minimal quantum of affordable
25%.
units. Right.
Or could they go and buy up certain number of properties on the Coast Guard and go ahead and put a multi-level, very high building up there?
No, because
So-
there's deed restrictions on those properties already in place.
Right, but with the deed restrictions, that's the question that is also scary to me, as part of this whole thing. If they can go ahead and ignore our zoning laws and build a huge skyrise, could they also ignore the deed restrictions that were voted on by the town of what we want to see on that property? So those are the things we're trying to avoid by putting in this kind of plan and keeping ahead of it.
That's
Well-
right, Josie. And the 2021 vote by town meeting simply authorized the board of selectmen to raise the properties, the buildings, and to sell. But we cannot sell them in contiguous parcels.
That's true. However, there's a lot of creativity in the real estate industry.
I'm sure there is.
And
Of course.
if they have affiliated buyers, which appear to be independent, that buy
Correct.
contiguous parcels, they could then sell them to a single buyer who consolidates from multiple original buyers from the town.
So we have to be very careful and get
Yep,
good at it.
that's why we want to stay ahead of it, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Josie. Okay, is there anybody else that has questions for the committee? Okay, I'm just scanning to see if there's any new questions. Suzanne, I see your hand up. Go right ahead.
Hi, Suzanne Macarelli, 15 Little Nahant Road. I have a question about the current waiting list. As we know, Nahant has 48 units of affordable housing. And last year, a member of the Nahant Housing Authority said that there were 9,700 people on that waiting list. Has that number increased or decreased since last year?
I have no
Dana
idea.
is online.
Dana, can
maybe
you
you
answer
could-
that?
I can say that it's north of 10,000, and it's a state controlled waiting list. So there are some preferences for people in the following sequence: homeless people, or in danger of being homeless, or disabled people. But the preference for local people is not very good. And
Dana, is that state waiting list applied? I mean, how many communities did that 10,000 number apply to? Just Nahant or a bunch of other communities?
Well, there's 351 communities in Massachusetts that, you know, and
So
about 351 have
is it
housing
a
authorities.
is it a collective statewide waiting list is my question, or a local
yeah,
one?
the answer is yes, it is. There are 351 towns in the state of Massachusetts, and there's also, I think, in compliance with 40B, maybe 71 towns. So it's important that we have a plan to get there in compliance with 40B. But the straw man that's been thrown up here that some developer is going to buy the tides and build a skyrise there, on the edge of the ocean, and so somehow get around the environmental laws. I don't really subscribe to that theory.
Well, they did it in Revere pretty successfully.
Yeah,
Can I just
And they
get,
did it on the Linway pretty successfully.
can I just get clarity on my question? Nahant's waiting list is 10,000 people to get into Nahant's 48 units, correct?
Yeah, Suzanne, it's a statewide list,
Okay,
and there's more than 10,000 people waiting for public housing on that list.
but
So
that means more than, it's not 10,000 waiting for the Nahant 48 units. It's 10,000 waiting for all the units in the state, correct?
yeah, that's right.
and priority goes to homeless and affirmative action, and then secondary to prioritization is preference of veterans and residents of that town. But that comes secondary to people who are of a higher priority because they fall into those other categories. Is that correct?
It
Dana?
is, and I can give you some anecdotal evidence about that too, Suzanne. Too,
Okay, thank you.
some units are filled by out of state applicants that are on the in-state Massachusetts list. So somebody in another state might get a unit before somebody from Nahant.
Let me try to clarify this a little bit more. Several years ago, the state changed their laws in terms of the housing authorities. And prior to that change, the housing authority, in terms of who was going to get a unit in Nahant, was pretty much limited to residents of Nahant. They opened that up to the entire state. And it's sort of like civil service exams. So if you qualify and you are in need of housing, regardless of where you live in the Commonwealth, you can choose to be located in any community in the Commonwealth, or you can choose or be more restrictive and say, no, I'm not going to move. I only want to be in X, Y, and Z. So the reason that we went from, maybe a couple dozen people residents looking for subsidized housing in the Nahant to 9,000 is because the state opened that up under Mass General Law to allow all Commonwealth residents who qualify to be eligible for housing anywhere.
Good
Thank you for
clarification.
that explanation, Mark. I appreciate it. Can I just follow up then? Just one more question, then I'll stop talking. The FAQs that were written, I read those, and one of the FAQs mentioned that 70 and again, this is more of a question than a statement. It sounded like the way it was written that a building is built in Nahant for affordable housing and 70% of that would be filled with Nahant residents. That doesn't sound accurate, so I'm assuming I misread it. Can you explain what that FAQ was actually trying to say? Because again, my takeaway was 70% of those residents in that building will be Nahanters.
It was at the local preference, Suzanne. Do you remember what question it was? What question number, excuse me?
I remember seeing the same statistic and I had the same kind of question. It had to do with the application or the effect of any preferences that
Yeah,
apply
so
to the
I
Nahant
have it.
housing. Yeah.
So that is only when there is a development agreement that has been agreed to between the town and a developer, where they can ask the state to give up to 70% of new affordable housing units reserved for Nahant residents. That's based on an application that the town would have to apply and working with the developer to get that type of requirement.
That's a good explanation, Michelle. Let me add on to that. There are two types of 40B. There's an unfriendly 40B, in which case where a community doesn't comply with the affordable housing standards, and a developer comes in and buys a piece of property, builds a complex, provides 25% of that complex to be affordable, and bypasses the zoning, town zoning bylaws. On the other hand, there's a friendly 40B in which a developer comes in and says to the town, listen, I don't want to be a jerk here. I want to work with the town. I understand the zoning issues. Can we have a development agreement, as Michelle referred to? In that development agreement, the town can ask the developer or place a condition on that development to have 70% of the occupancy for the affordable occupancy designated to residents of Nahant or variation of that, veterans or something along those lines.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Suzanne. Great questions.
I do have a follow-up question on that though, if I can. Where it did say 70% can be set aside for applicants that reside currently in Nahant. My question, because my parents could easily qualify, I'm gonna be honest with you, so I have a good personal question. But does that mean that you could have a development agreement that says 70% can be put aside for Nahant residents, but they have to meet the priority placements that the state has? For example, an emergency refugee would have priority over you, a homeless person, a disabled addict, a family with children. Those are all priorities over the average Nahant resident who's looking for, the ability to live in one of these units. So the clarification is 70% can apply, but will they have to meet the prioritization? And that's a good question that I'm not sure has been very clarified. And when I read that particular statistics, I said, I'm not sure that it really explains it well enough. So do we have a better explanation?
So Josie, it's
Maybe
Michelle.
Dana, maybe, can you answer it based on your experience?
Josephine, hi. Sorry, could you please ask me the question again?
Sure. So even though a developer could agree to set aside 70% of the subsidized housing for Nahant residents to apply for, based on the state prioritizations, if a Nahant resident who is 80 years old, disabled, veteran, tries to get this unit, will they be also required to meet the prioritization of affordable housing placement? For example, ahead of them would be a homeless person, a disabled addict, a refugee from another state, et cetera, et cetera. So can you describe better being able to apply is different than being guaranteed that you can be prioritized for it. Like a veteran could easily be bumped out by
I've
a
seen it.
refugee.
Yeah. Josephine, that's a great question. Now, there's a couple things I want to throw out there. First, this development would have to be part of the housing authority, subject to those rules. And I think what we're talking about here in a 40B development is not a public housing building or buildings within the Nahant Housing Authority. So having said that, but if it was in the public housing authority, yes, the short answer to your question is yes. Now, if somebody was homeless, disabled, a veteran, they have like the highest priority. But if somebody's just plain homeless, they're the first priority. Second priority is disabled, but like some combination. And then below that, veterans, if they're not disabled or they're not homeless or at risk of being homeless, that's kind of the way it works. But honestly, I feel like I need to know more about this waiting list, statewide waiting list. It's been critiqued around the state, and I think at some point the laws are going to change, because the way it works now is when there's an opening, the executive director of our housing authority has to go shopping around for tenants and calling them and say, hey, do you want to come live in Nahant? And, fill out the requirements of minorities and disabled people and elderly people, and try to make it all fit with the goals. And that it just doesn't work. And as a member of the commissioners, I have no visibility on who's on the list. And by law, I have no say so. And I just don't know the exact number, but I know it's more than 10,000, and it's not easy for Nahant people to get into the public housing in town.
Josie, let me just jump in a little here. There's a section between what we were originally talking about as a friendly 40B, in which there would be a development agreement between the developer and the town of Nahant. That's separate from what happens with the housing authority. Under a development agreement, under a friendly 40B, and a friendly 40B, I believe has to have at least 25% of the units affordable. Under that agreement, the town can require the developer to allow up to 75%, 70% of the available affordable units to be designated to Nahant residents, or Nahant, veteran Nahant residents, a combination of the two. That's my understanding. It's separate from the Nahant Housing Authority.
Okay, that's a huge distinction. So even though it's subsidized housing, because I don't like using the word affordable.
It's not subsidized housing.
Not
Okay.
subsidized housing.
You have to distinguish the two. We're talking about affordable housing. So we're not bringing in the subsidized housing piece into it.
Okay,
Well,
so
wait a
then
minute,
let me
even a
ask a
friendly,
different question. So for the subsidized housing, okay, forget about the friendly 40B, which is more just inventory of lower rent or lower home ownership, okay? In the subsidized housing that we are required to build or come up with, we cannot ask for set-asides for Nahant residents. It is whoever has priority in the state based on state requirements, correct?
Dana, that's you.
Okay, because there's a lot of confusion. I mean, I'm confused and I'm on the committee, right?
I'm
The
gonna
word
suggest that
affordable,
this is,
I want to keep it separate than subsidized.
I'm gonna
Josie,
suggest that this is,
you're right. It is confusing. And I can't give you the definition you're looking for because I simply don't have it. I'm sorry. But it's just exceedingly difficult for the public housing to go to a Nahant resident. But I'd like to take your question and go back to the 70% requirement. So in our current housing production plan draft, that 70% is being discouraged. The way it was written by MAPC into the plan, they are trying to, they want us to not use that 70% local people in the plan. And it's in the language there. So that's another area of the plan that I'd like to see edited in that regard. The 70% reserved for local people for a 40B developer. Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Dana, it's Michelle. I'm not clear about your statements.
Who are you
The
talking to?
70% is for an affordable housing development. It doesn't, it's broad in its sense, not subsidized housing.
I'm going to suggest we consult the consultants about clarity on this, because there's at least 3 categories that need to be distinguished, and the rules are virtually certain to be very complex and confusing. And I don't think we're going to advance the ball by discussing it with people's current opinions, as good faith as they are held. There's a lot of complexity here, and we're unlikely to get a right answer. So I think it's better to defer it so that we don't leave people with confusion.
Okay.
Michelle, were you
Josh,
asking me that question? Was that question
yeah,
directed at me?
my question was directed to you around, it's around affordable housing broadly. It's not necessarily subsidized housing. And I don't think we would ever be able to dedicate 70% of a subsidized housing project to Nahant residents. We
Okay,
would have
but
to get-
the question
it's
was,
still an application to the state, regardless, whether it's an affordable housing development or a subsidized housing project.
okay, so my comment was about this 70% reserved for local people, and how the current housing production plan tends to discourage that 70% number and ask the town not to go for that 70% local people reservation in affordable housing here.
Where does it say that?
Where does it say that? It states what it is. It's in our goals
Yeah.
to consider local preference for an affordable housing development.
Yeah, I don't
Okay,
think
I don't have chapter and verse in front of me, but
Right. If
but
you
I
want to
can
send me a
provide
quick email, what section you're looking at, I'll take a look at it.
Sure, well, let's move on. Thank you.
Okay. Josh, I see your hands up again.
Yes, thanks. Josh Antrim, 267 Nahant Road. Just in light of, well, I support what Mike said, that you got to get to the bottom of this, but, given what Dana outlined for prioritization, I guess I'd just caution the committee about making statements that the housing would be for local police and firemen and teachers and so on, because that sounds nice, but it's so far it sounds like that's not really an accurate statement. Well, I'd encourage you to look into that a little bit more, because I don't think we want to mislead people into saying, this is for, our local people, when it's not.
So we said earlier that the local preference requires an application and approval from the state. So we're not making any guarantees, and it also requires, a developer that's going to want to allow that as well. So I'm not making any guarantees that
Yeah.
we're gonna develop a program or a project and say 70% of whatever we build is gonna go to Nahant residents.
Yeah.
Again, it's based on what, we're still many steps ahead of it. We haven't even picked a site yet, frankly.
Yeah,
So.
no, I know, but I mean, I just,
Right.
philosophically, I think, we
I
don't want to
agree with
mislead
you.
people about the situation.
Yep.
And I guess so that's just a statement. And I did have a question, which is the format of the plan somewhat sort of dictated by the state or by the consultants? There's things in there that I think I'd categorize them as more editorial comments than really related to production plans. Like, for example, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit circulation and racial diversity of the town.
So I'll comment on the racial diversity piece.
Yeah.
That came from the the housing needs assessment. And one of the elements of the housing production plan is to have a housing needs assessment done, which we did earlier this year. So we need to comment on the makeup of the community. If you think it's editorializing, I'm happy, I'll call you tomorrow and we can talk, specifically, and we can
Yeah.
edit if you want. I'm no
I
problem
think-
with that.
I think, Michelle, that specific question that Josh brought up came directly out of our public forums and the questions in our public forum. In terms of diversity and those types of things. Some people have some issues about that. Josh, I did want to comment on the 70% Nahant residents. I was responding to Suzanne's question about affordability, and I want to say about infrastructure, and and I think I brought up police, fire, and those types of things. I think the plan indicates that 48%, I think it's 48% of the residents in the Nahant would now qualify for affordable housing under today's standard. And the point I was trying to make was that, the 48% of the people in the Nahant who would qualify for affordable housing, a large portion of them, or a portion of them, are public employees, police, fire, DPW. Those are the types of people who, and many others, who qualify under affordable housing. I wasn't saying we set that aside, 70% aside, but I was just trying to make a point.
Yep, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Dana?
Hi, Michelle and everybody. You wanted a reference to the 70% question as addressed in the housing production plan. So there's a page in the plan where it's discussed on page 100. And then in the paragraph, I don't want to slow down the meeting, and thanks for asking the question. But there's a it defines the 70% of new affordable housing units be reserved for Nahant residents, which is known as local preference. This must be done with accordance to federal, state, fair housing laws. And then it goes on to say, when making an application for local preference, Nahant should also consider that the population is predominantly white, and applying for a high percentage of local preference units limits the ability to welcome new residents and advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's arguing against using the 70% for affordable housing units.
So I think they're making the correlation there, Dana, to our housing needs assessment. And that's a true statement. If you
True or not, it's saying that the 70% is not something Nahant should do. The plan. That's what the plan says. I didn't write it, so
it doesn't say that, Dana.
It doesn't say that.
Well, what does it say then?
Well, what you just read doesn't say that.
What says when making an application for local preference? It's telling us the local preference. It doesn't want us to use 70% local people.
No, it said, I thought you said we should consider it.
It says when making an application for local preference, Nahant should, it's in the chat. Read it. Nahant should also consider that the population is predominantly white. And excuse me, I have the floor here. Nahant should also consider that the population is predominantly white, and applying for a higher percentage of local preference units limits the ability to welcome new residents, diversity, equity, etc.
Right, consider. We will consider it.
So it's arguing against the 70% local people.
No, it's not. It says we should consider it.
I disagree, Mark. Sorry.
The word is considered. It says considered.
We in this committee are not making the decision about this topic. It's left to others. So I don't think we need to.
Only come up if there's a development agreement. So
right. Every voice should be heard here. So I understand that. All I'm saying is that MAPC, who is the primary developer of this plan with the approval of the Housing Production Committee, they put this language in there, and we voted for it. So.
Okay, let's consider that
There you go.
MAPC is in the business of doing these plans for lots and lots of committees. And they probably developed our plan by taking one that they had recently done for another community and editing and cutting and pasting to adapt to local conditions. So a lot of this language is probably boilerplate. And they're also mobilized to be, if you will, conscious of concentrations of wealth and ethnicity, and be alert to those to the factors that have brought that about. So they've flagged that. They've asked us to consider it, and that does not say disadvantage the veterans. It just says keep an open mind as to this stuff.
Hey, this is Josie. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So this is where we're walking a fine line of whether this plan is a Nahant plan or a plan by our consultants speaking to us on behalf of the state. If that is a difficult editorializing comment, I would also encourage the selectmen again, I didn't vote, I wasn't there that day. I had been part of the committee for a while. I wasn't there the day that the quorum of folks who were on the committee passed this. Consider taking out those kinds of languages, but I am in the law, okay? Take out those kinds of things that are more the consultants speaking to us. It's a plan from us to the state. We should not be lectured. We should not be cutting and pasting from somebody's template or anything like that. So I think it's a good point to consider for us to vet it once more, to take out those things that they are speaking to us and telling us what to do. This is simply a plan so that we can avoid any hostile issues.
But
Thank
they
you.
are speaking to us from a standpoint of having had much experience with the state authorities who have to approve this plan. And our statements and our pronouncements in the plan are going to be scrutinized by state authorities. And if we're too cavalier about it, we may put a whole bunch of effort into this and have the state bounce it back for purpose of, because we are being too cavalier about social conditions that this whole thing is supposed to respond to. So I think we need to be pretty careful about that.
That's a very interesting point I had not thought about. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you, Michael. Josh, I see your hands up again.
Yeah, sorry to keep chiming in.
No,
Josh,
it's
after
good.
267, but I think Josie articulated what I've been wondering about very well, which is, are some of these things that I consider to be sort of editorial comments, are they in there to appease the state? Or are they in there because it's what the committee has decided on their own? And if those editorial, I'll call for convenience, I'll call them editorial comments, if they are in there to appease the state, does that, as Mike pointed out, risk the chance of the plan being not approved by the state? Because when I first read through it, I thought, what does the bus route have to do, for, as an example, what does this bus route have to do with affordable housing, for example? Like I don't think there's anybody in Nahant that doesn't take the bus because they can't get to the bus route. So the question is, how much of this is in there to appease the state? And if we pare this down, because it's 100 and something pages and we're expecting town meeting to vote on this, it's a long thing for people to go through. So if we pare this down to a more manageable size by removing what I'd call those editorial comments, are we risking the plan not being approved by the state?
So Josh, it's Michelle. There's a couple of things. So one is, as I mentioned earlier, that housing needs assessment to identify the makeup of the community. And, the community is made up of predominantly white people. There's nothing that we're going to be able to skirt around it. The state is going to look at the lack of diversity in the town, and that could impact us in terms of if we ever apply for grants or funding for development. And they may come back to us and say, yes, however, you are going to have to limit local preference.
Mhm.
The second thing around bus routes, in order to create housing opportunities for people, we have to make sure there's transportation available to them. So depending on where those developments are, whether it's multifamily or affordable housing, it's important that we have a transit system in the community. The third thing is about the framework and the structure of this document. I agree with you. It's very consultant speak, and I've been a management consultant for 20 years, so I can definitely speak to this. And I've attempted to guide them and ask them to take other things out of this plan, but at some point, there are things that you're going to have to just step away and say, let the process run. I think for the most part, you know, this is a good document for us. It represents Nahant well. It will go to the state for state approval. It does not need town meeting approval. The only adoption that's needed is by the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board. So town meeting will have their voice should there be a development site selected, and the Board of Selectmen bring that to town meeting for their approval and say, we'd like to take X property and work with X developer and do this proposal. I reflect on the 2008 plan for the Coast Guard housing at one point, where that was going to went to town meeting and was approved. It would be something similar to that type of event.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
can I just-
so I mean, sorry, I'll just quickly wrap up, and I promise I'll stop asking questions. But
Okay.
as you point out, Michelle, I have to vote on this soon. I think it's next week. So that's part of the reason I'm asking all these questions right now.
No, this is great. We're
yeah.
happy to have you here.
Yeah, so I guess the 10% affordable housing requirement applies to every community in Massachusetts, regardless of whether there's a bus running through town. So why is it in the plan? That as an example. Or if Nahant is 100% white or 100% black or 100% Asian, you still have to meet the 10% requirement. So I guess that's what I mean by editorial comments. So
Okay.
First,
I mean, we
Josh,
talk about MBTA 3A in the plan as a reflection point, because that's the next requirement of the state to create multifamily housing. And their strategy around multifamily housing is to create it along transportation lines. That's why Nahant has been identified as an adjacent MBTA community.
yes,
but you
understood.
need to understand, Josh, that the bus route issue, the 3A issue, is almost completely independent of the affordable housing issue. You need to look at each of those separately, and the statutes didn't have to coincide right now. It could have been that the state waited a couple of years to enact the 3A, the bus route thing, and we still would have to deal with the 40B issue. So the affordability issue is one where we have to create a certain amount of subsidized housing that is independent of our requirement to create a zoning district under the MBTA law 3A that would call for multifamily, and they really don't overlap much on each other at all.
Yeah, no, I do understand that. But thanks for pointing it out anyway.
All right,
thanks.
let me take a look at the chat. I think there's a few questions, so I'm just going to work backwards. Jeff Lewis, is it safe to say all subsidized housing will fall under the Nahant Housing Authority? I defer that to Dana. I would assume so, but I can't confirm that.
Well, a friendly 40B would provide for housing that would get us toward the safe harbor, but that would not necessarily be under the housing authority, correct?
Well, there's a distinction again between affordable housing and subsidized housing.
Right. This is
Subsidized
subsidized
housing can qualify as affordable housing.
Yeah.
I,
But I mean, I'm sorry, if we use if we hook up with a developer and do a friendly 40B, and I think it requires that they're rental units, but that gets us a long way toward achieving our safe harbor, whether the units themselves are deeded as subsidized or not. Do you understand that differently, Mark?
no, that's correct.
Okay, and so those units would not be under the Nahant Housing Authority, even though they would help us toward the 40B safe harbor.
Yes, I understand. You can have subsidized units under deed restrictions that are not technically under the housing authority.
That's right, Mark.
Okay,
And
Um,
so for those who are familiar with projects like Habitat for Humanity, those are subsidized homes, deed restricted homes, but they wouldn't be under the Nahant Housing Authority. They would be a private home, okay? But they are deed restricted. So that is one absolutely viable option as well for homeownership versus just only rentals that are open for all of those prioritizations of people who can get into them.
mhm. So there is a question in here from George Mahogan to describe what deed restriction is. So as I understand, deed restriction is a covenant placed on property that allows the property to be valued below market rate. So someone that comes in that has a certain level of income is able to buy that property and get a mortgage. The deed restriction can stay with, as long as 20 years, depending on what the covenant says on the property, or it can be in perpetuity. But what it does is it affords people at a level of income to be able to buy a home.
Also provides for, it's available to be done on a rental basis too.
Yes, it can be done on rental property as well. I think there was another question here. Just a comment, I think. It said, the 40B rule has been in effect for 54 years. Why such a rush now? No one has done it in such a long time. What makes it think it will happen? I don't know if it will or will not happen, whether we ever will see an unfriendly 40B development, but we are trying to be like every other community in Massachusetts to become compliant with the state, so we don't impact ourselves should an unfriendly 40B development come in, nor do we want to impact any funding opportunities that are available to our community, such as grants that the town has been fortunate to be able to apply and receive.
And also,
Right.
it's worth looking at the development along Route 1A to see the intensity of construction that's going on. And there's nothing that I know that makes Nahant, gives Nahant any other safe harbor than the 40B safe harbor to protect us against a hostile 40B, as other communities have experienced.
Okay. So great comments from everyone, great questions. We are still here for you. If anyone has any questions they would like to ask, anything that we haven't covered.
Yeah, Tom Walsh, 9 Range Road. What is the proposed amount of units that you guys are thinking of in total?
We have no proposal for any units. It would be dependent on whatever opportunity site is selected and what type of development agreement is created. What the initial step we need to do though is create some design guidelines so that we have those in hand to give to a developer for a site should, the site be approved at town meeting. And those design guidelines would really help, ensure that we're meeting the neighborhood requirements, the community requirements. Lynn, I see your hands up. Thank you.
You're muted, Lynn.
Thanks. I've been a appreciative listener throughout this dialogue. At this point, I'd like to make this contribution because Michelle, you just opened a door for me. Thank you very much.
Good.
Yes, I think that there are follow-ups that need to happen to this report. And the design guidelines, I believe, are an important follow-up. As the chairman of community preservation, I also want to say that our committee recommended the funding of this study, and thank goodness the town meeting approved it. Our committee will resume its cycle of initiating grant applications, the process of initiating grant applications and their review for the upcoming town meeting. We meet on Monday, the November 6th. We're just our initiating meeting for this session. But I would say that the community preservation offers good opportunity for funding for things like design guidelines or additional sort of, concrete proposals for affordable housing. Either actual projects or, further sort of, I hate to say studies, but further planning that actually will promote affordable housing in a meaningful way in Nahant. I also think that it's important to make a distinction in terms. We've used subsidized housing very frequently in this discussion today. And with that subsidized housing comes, I think, an association with public funding for housing. That is different than affordable housing, which has, I think, a lot more independence just independence. It's not necessarily getting public money for your housing. So anyway, lots of things to learn, to think about and work through as we're doing this. But I would have to say this committee's been thoughtful, progressive at the same time, searching for solutions and questioning things in a very critical way. And it's been a privilege to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. That was great. Okay, Suzanne, I see your hands raised. Go ahead.
One quick question, because we have a member from FinCom here. At what point is FinCom going to weigh in with a financial impact statement, or this has some financial impact on the residents of Nahant? It could be in minimal impact, maximum impact. We don't know. And I know you're going to say, well, until we have a design of a building we're going to build, we can't say. But if it's going to be at the Coast Guard housing lots, well, we're not going to get taxes, right, from those lots. That would be one thing that comes to mind. But my question is, at what point is FinCom going to have a meeting and start talking about this? Am I putting you on the spot, Dan? You're muted, Dan.
Dan, you're muted.
Dan, I'm sorry if I put you on the spot, but it's just, since you're here, I just figured I'd ask.
Thank you, Suzanne. I cannot speak for the FinCom. Obviously, we don't have a quorum of FinCom folks. I can only speak for Dan McMack and 20 Rollins Avenue. And yes, I think that's a very good point. Any of this discussion needs to look at the revenue that would be achieved from the sale of the lots in the Coast Guard housing area and the future taxes for perpetuity that would be generated from those lots when dwellings are placed on them. So that's a huge thing. And I suspect, I can only speak for myself, that would be of great interest to the Finance and Advisory Committee. That said, I was also puzzled, and this is kind of, does that answer the question, Suzanne? Because I had another point that I had hoped to make since I have the floor.
Yeah, I mean, as a taxpayer, I'm curious, like, what is the impact on me? I mean, I don't know how the Board of Selectmen can even vote on a plan without having that information, but I'm not a selectman. I'm just a taxpayer, and I just want to get educated on how it's going to impact me.
That's an outstanding point. Thank you for raising it. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the committee. I can see that a great deal of effort has gone into coming up with the 6 potential action items. to be forwarded to the state. My question would be, we have a firm town meeting approved plan for the Coast Guard housing. It received a supermajority vote, and it is a plan that is well underway. Why would that property make it on the list of 6, but the Greystone property, which the town already owns, received silence? Was there something I was unaware of on that? I guess I'll tee that up to your group, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So Greystone Road is on the list as an opportunity site. The second comment I would make is for the Coast Guard housing, our recommendation was to sell the lots to pay off the loan and hold back some of the lots for an affordable housing project. Now that means, it doesn't mean it's going to be subsidized housing. It
Right.
still could be an affordable housing project that's deed restricted and we're still getting tax revenue from it. So I want to make sure we understand the distinction about what the affordable housing recommendation is for Coast Guard housing.
Let me just jump in here, Michelle, a little, because I am the chairman. Although I'm a member of this committee, I am the chairman of the Board of Selectmen. And there's been some questions about what the position of the selectmen are. And I can't tell you what the position is. I can tell you what my position is as an individual, a member of the board. And I've repeated it a number of times at committee hearings over the past year with this committee, and I repeated it again at our special town meeting. It is my intention as a single member of the Board of Selectmen to honor the 2021 town meeting vote insofar as to selling off the lots to pay off the debt that the town owes. If there is property that is left over, or if there's an area that is left over after that is accomplished, I certainly would consider, as recommended by this committee, in which I approved, to bring that back to town meeting for reconsideration. I would like to remind people who are looking here that, you know, things change over time. And I have an institutional memory here. In 2010, the town meeting voted overwhelmingly by 80% to make the entire Coast Guard housing property affordable housing. And the reason that didn't happen was because the housing market collapsed and the developer lost financing. So things change over time. Things are not static. I will, as one member of the Board of Selectmen, honor the 2021 town meeting vote insofar as to selling the properties and paying off the loan. And then we'll see what happens after that. But that's not my decision. That will be a decision of town meeting.
Thank you, Mark. Lynn, I see your hands up. I don't know if you have a comment.
Oh, sorry. I can lower it now, thanks. I'm done.
Dan, did you have any follow-up questions?
No, not at this time. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay. One thing I will let you know, as a member of FinCom, I did send the housing plan to the chair this week, so he could share it with the committee and decide when they would like to review and discuss it. And I also offered to meet with the committee as well to, you know, answer any of their questions. The other thing I would say is, in terms of, you know, financial analysis, I would not, you know, go too deep into that. We need a financial analysis for all of the housing goals and strategies or the development sites. I think what we need to do is remind ourselves that this is just a strategy document. It's a plan to demonstrate to the state that we as a community are going to be able to support and address and contribute to the affordable housing crisis that's going on, you know, and try to be thoughtful and attempt to, you know, develop and increase housing inventory, because it's not just around, you know, a subsidized housing and 10,000 people that are on some list. It's about creating homes for people so they can live in our community. So I think whatever happens in terms of a financial analysis should be done once the town has made a decision on a site. And then we can start moving forward with all of the necessary criteria to develop that site.
To that point, back to Greystone, I didn't see Greystone among the 6 action items.
It may be described differently.
There,
Oh, sorry.
so in terms of the construction of the document, the action items are around the housing goals, strategies, and implementation. So Greystone Road is one of the opportunity sites. And so we did have a specific call out around Coast Guard housing because our conversations and our decisions were made before we went to town meeting vote on what was going to happen to that property. So we can, again, like I said, the plan can change. We could hear next week that the board of selectmen want to do something different. We could hear, from the planning board, a recommendation. I don't know. But this is the plan that we as a committee have created and put forward. We're proud of this plan. We've worked hard in debating and challenging ourselves over the last 11 months for this plan. And as I mentioned, I think it's the first step for many steps this community is going to see around addressing affordable housing. Okay, thank you. All right, I have 8:39. We've plenty of time left for any more questions or comments from the public or anything from the committee.
Well, I just want to say, I mean, I'm sure we'll have other meetings, Michelle, but I want to thank you as chair, the wonderful job you did over the past year, pulling this all together. I know that you've tried your hardest to engage the community through public forums. I know you spent hours on end on your personal time trying to address a lot of the questions that the community has had, and I appreciate the work that you've put into this.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Mark.
Here, here. Here, here.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn?
I have a motion to adjourn. Is there a second on the motion?
I'll make a second.
Patty is second the motion. So we'll go to a roll call vote. Michael,
Aye.
Lynn,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
Dana,
Aye.
Josie,
Aye.
Patty.
Aye.
I think that's it. We are adjourning at 8:40 p.m. Thank you to the members of the public that called in tonight and contributed to the forum and the discussion. It was very productive and we appreciate everyone's time. Have a great evening and a great weekend and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.